hello, and it is good to come back to continue with the series on key texts. Today I have chosen a text, Berger and Thomas Luckmann, The Social Construction of Reality, a Treatise in the Sociology of Knowledge. As many of you who have been following this series would realize, we are making a combination of texts drawn from the social sciences as well as the humanities on one hand, drawing from texts from the South Asian context as well as texts from the rest of the world and particularly the Western context. So we are attempting to showcase in a certain sense many of these key texts which have been written at different historical points in very different societies, but which have a certain resonance, which still are relevant in making sense of the reality within which we live in 21st century India. Berger and Thomas Luckmann, The Social Construction of Reality, a Treatise in the Sociology of Knowledge. As the title suggests, there are two parts to the book, so to say, two parts which make the argument of the book. One is the social construction of reality. The second is a treatise in the sociology of knowledge. The central point that is being made in this entire text is that we as human beings are products of society, but we in turn, with our everyday knowledge, our common sense knowledge, reproduce society. We are both products and producers of society. This reality, we confront this reality as an objective entity existing outside us. We are born into an objective reality which is there before us and which will continue after us, and to that extent it is objective. And at the same time, we make sense of that reality, we contribute towards making that objective reality. That is, our subjective participation, subjective action are very key components in constructing this reality. So this is the basic argument. What he's trying to do, or what Berger and Luckmann together are trying to do, is to argue that we can't look at social reality, which is the object of inquiry in the social sciences, as something which is external to us alone. It is external, and at the same time it is internalized in us through the process of socialization. So let's try and go step by step. The basic argument, and to reiterate, I've already made this point, the basic contentions of the argument of the book are implicit in the title and the subtitle, namely, reality is socially constructed, one, and that sociology of knowledge must analyze the process in which this occurs. Now, what do we mean by reality is socially constructed? There is a very widely held misconception that when we say socially constructed, it means imagined, it means fictitious. We don't use the word socially constructed as something which is unreal, fictitious, imagined, false. What we mean by socially constructed is that the society within which we are members have been constituted and constructed through human action, which is not just physical but also meaningful, within which language, symbols, signs, as much as physical, material labor have a role in its construction. So socially constructed, not in the sense of being imagined or false, but in the understanding as being humanly made up. And the sociology of knowledge is interested in exploring how is this society constructed? What do we mean when we say society is constructed? What are the processes which are involved in the construction of this society? Now, there are two key words here, reality and knowledge. What do we mean by it? Now, Berger and Luckmann make a distinction between the way philosophers look at reality and knowledge. between the layman's understanding of reality and knowledge and between the sociologist's understanding of reality and knowledge. The philosopher very often asks very fundamental questions like what is the nature of reality, what is truth, what is not truth, how do we know this is reality, etc. Sociologists, for the most part, define reality as something which exists independent of whether we wish to see it or whether we do not wish to see it, something which is there as something we cannot wish away. And we define knowledge as the certainty that phenomena are real and that they possess specific characteristics. To reiterate, philosophers go into fundamental question. Lay people usually take their everyday practical knowledge and the knowledge that they have to cope with their life as knowledge, and they see that knowledge as truth, as that knowledge as the knowledge, primary knowledge, whereas for sociologists they recognize that there are different kinds of realities, and corresponding to different kinds of realities there are different kinds of knowledges, because central to the discipline of sociology is a certain cynical, critical take. Do not take anything for granted. Whereas for the everyday woman or man in the street, you take everything for granted. Everyday reality is taken for granted. If we didn't take everyday reality for granted, we would not be able to function in society. If I, for example, were not informed by the institution which is hosting this talk that my talk is at so and so time on such and such a date, I would not be able to organize my schedule and reach here at the requisite time. If I was not familiar with the audience who am addressing, some known, some unknown, some I'm guessing, I wouldn't know how to address. So there is a certain reason why everyday reality is taken for granted and why the woman in the street or the man in the street has a taken for granted nature. His knowledge of that reality is taken for granted. The sociologist cannot do this because of his systematic weakness of the fact that men in the street have quite different realities for granted as between one society and another. For example, in our everyday life, people who are not oriented towards critical social sciences, who are very located within the world that they occupy, they would assume that the food that they eat is natural, normal. The way they behave with their parents or brothers or sisters or cousins or friends is natural or normal. They would feel that reality is primary, and that reality is not only coercive, external, but is also normative. That is how you should behave. Whereas, for example, in quite some another sense, the sociologist accepts the fact of relative realities, multiple realities which exist independent of each other and very often has corresponding stock of knowledge, common sense knowledge to navigate in those worlds of those societies. The sociologist's discipline demands that he asks, why are there different kinds of realities and what is the connection between these realities and the knowledge concept? There is a certain relativity of knowledge, certain recognition that social relativity of knowledge. Now you must remember that Berger and Luckmann wrote this book in the early 60s. I think they began this project around 63. Book was published in around 66. And many of the examples that they offer really belong to the America of the 1960s. And one of the examples they give to explain social relativity and knowledge is that there are multiple realities, and what is real to a Tibetan monk may not be real to an American businessman, and that the knowledge of the criminal would differ from the knowledge of the criminologist. For example, in a particular society where maybe the idea of renunciation is very important, the idea of renunciation is the charter or the manner in which you live your life, would make complete sense to a society where from the time you're born, you're taught that at certain point of your life you have to renounce. Whereas in the world of capitalism, contemporary society, which perhaps the American businessmen to whom Berger and Luckmann are referring to, that would be completely ridiculous, because what you're doing is inaction, entrepreneurizing, dynamic, innovative, capturing the spirit of modern capitalism. So he says each world or each reality has a corresponding sense of knowledge which helps them to operate here. Now, by now, you would be very clear, therefore, that the sociology of knowledge, which Berger and Luckmann are talking about, is not knowledge in the sense of high knowledge, intellectual ideas, great philosophies or great theories. What they are talking about is knowledge in human societies and ordinary knowledge, and knowledge which help us to function in our everyday life, and also the processes by which this knowledge becomes socially accepted, established and legitimized. So the focus here is on the knowledge of everyday life. Now, in this chapter, The Foundations of Knowledge in Everyday Life, the focus, as I keep mentioning, is on the everyday, not the remote, not the transcendental, religious, philosophical, but our everyday life, everyday practices, not religion as stated in the high texts, but religion as it is practiced in everyday life. Knowledge about life, meaning about life, goal of life, child rearing practices, food cooking practices, organization of our life, hierarchies, family, kinship. Every institution has also its knowledge practices. And he says one of the examples, he says there are many features of everyday life and everyday knowledge and everyday reality. And one of this is there are multiple realities. There are many kinds of realities, And as I move from one reality to another, I experience the transition as a kind of shock. The shock is to be understood as caused by the shift of attentiveness that the transition entails. Waking up from a dream illustrates this shift most simply. All of us have experienced dreams which are really very, very alive, real, dreams which have people from our real world inhabiting those dreams. But when we wake up, we have for a moment of shock, oh, that was a dream, and we are back into our everyday life. This he calls the transition as a kind of shock. So there are multiple realities. So when I'm at home doing my cooking or gardening or looking after various family members, etc., that is one kind of everyday life. Whereas maybe when I come here and I have to give a talk and I have to look at the camera or be recorded in a particular way, it's another kind of life where I cannot do what I was doing in another life. But here too, this is temporary. Whereas once this lecture ends, I return back to my everyday life. So there are multiple realities, and you can transit from one reality to another to kind of shock. But importantly, among these multiple reality, there is one that presents itself as the reality par excellence. And this is the reality of everyday life. It occupies a privileged space. The tension of consciousness is highest in the everyday life, and the latter imposes itself on consciousness in the most massive, urgent and intense manner. Meaning the way we live our everyday life, that is our most important reality, paramount reality. For example, you may go and see a film, and you watch the film, and when the hall gets dark and the film comes alive, you are moving into another reality. The moment that film is over, you're back in your paramount everyday reality. And if you have to explain to somebody something about that film, you have to translate it in the language which exists in your everyday reality or everyday world. It often happens with religious experiences, and you are very moved, maybe there's a particular mystical experience, but if you have to again communicate this mystical experience to somebody else, it has to be done in the language of everyday life, in the categories and concepts which govern everyday life, So you have the point that being made, one, there are multiple realities, and you transit from one multiple reality to another. There is an element of shock. And third, that among the multiple reality, it is the everyday reality which is paramount, which is, wide awake state of existing in apprehending the reality of everyday life. And this reality is seen as normal, self-evident. It constitutes my natural attitude. I'll spend just a little bit of time on these particular words: normal, self-evident, constituting my natural attitude. Because remember, Berger and Luckmann are trying to tell you that when we study reality, we don't only study the physical objects which are there, houses, trains, roads, railways, we are also talking about human interaction, the meaning attributed to even the material goods, and so therefore we have to understand the society as meaningful, as having certain kind of very strong ideas. And not only do we believe in it, we see it as normal, as something we don't even think about, that it is self-evident, it's natural. We, in our society, when we live, we know, we have knowledge about how we ought to behave. If there is a senior elderly person, we know how to talk to an elderly citizen or an elderly person. We know how to talk to a little child. That knowledge is taken for granted. It is a knowledge which is normal. And maybe if you go to a society which is different, very different from yours, you suddenly realize that I don't know knowledge, I'm awkward, I don't know how to behave because they do it very differently. This is the kind of knowledge that Peter, Berger and Luckmann are trying to look at, that the knowledge of everyday life which makes the functioning and the consolidation of social reality possible. Now, so we said multiple realities, we talked about transition, we talked about paramount reality of everyday life, and then the point that when we as human subjects encounter this objective reality, we see everyday life as an ordered reality. There is a pattern, prearranged pattern that seem to be independent of my apprehension of them, and they impose themselves upon the latter. The reality of everyday life appears already objectified, constituted by an order of objects that have been designated as objects before my appearance on the scene. Just to go back a little bit, I was trying to tell you that Berger and Luckmann were trying to show the connection between the objective reality and the subjective reality. And here he's saying that the everyday life, when we enter it, it already seems to have an order which was there before I entered in. Independent of my apprehension or understanding and observation, it was already patterned in a particular fashion. These objects seem to be already designated. So apart from everyday life being multiple realities, paramount everyday life has an ordered reality. As we move forward, we'll explain how does this order get constituted. And then he goes on to say that this whole issue of the ordered reality has to be explored further. And we can take hypothetically any individual. The example he gives is from America, the example of tools of a person who is geographically designated, that is in America, who's employing tools like can openers, sports cars, technical vocabulary, relationships, and this manner, when you speak about maybe a sports car or a can opener or a particular drink or a particular kind of food or particular chess club or particular church membership, others also understand this. And why do the others understand this? Because you speak a common language, and this language marks the coordinates of my life in society and fills that life with meaningful objects. For a minute, let's move away from the American example, and let's take an Indian urban example. Many places now which were small towns are now big cities. Many places which were large villages are now small towns. So many things today in 21st century India you would be very, very familiar. For example, I think a lot of people would know when they're talking about mobile telephones, and the different brands of mobile telephones and what kind of apps should be downloaded. Maybe even 4 years ago, people wouldn't know what WhatsApp was. Everybody now knows what WhatsApp is, so they would be familiar. People would be a large young people would know what entrance examinations of maybe to the IIT or engineering colleges or medical colleges, or maybe the NET exam, or maybe the JRF exams, or a multiple kind of entrance exams. When they use these words, they will know what it means. So if a young person asks the other person, how is your preparation going? Tiyari kaise chal rahi hai? They will understand, because they are geographically designated. They are employing a language which is common and shared in that geographical location, and they mark the coordinates of their life and fills that life with meaningful objects, and you have this knowledge. You don't even think about it, you take it for granted. But if you speak that same kind of thing for a member of a society from quite another world, they will not understand what you're talking about. So this knowledge is critical for the functioning of society. Now he goes on to say that this everyday reality is spatial as well as temporal. What does he mean by it? It's very, very simple, that I experience everyday life in terms of different degrees of closeness and remoteness, both spatially and temporally. There are some people I meet face to face, directly. And there are some people I'm close to, but whom I'm not in immediate proximity. But as in most of my life, I know what is of interest to me, what is my foci, so to say. I know how to organize my life. Certain things are important to me. That knowledge is important for me to function. Certain kinds of knowledge are unimportant to me. Now, the example that Berger and Luckmann gives, which may be relevant or may not be relevant in our own context, is that you have a mechanic, in a car garage, and he knows how to repair cars, but he may not be interested to know about testing laboratories of the automobile industry, because it actually, in objective sense, even that testing will ultimately impact his life. But as far as he is concerned, he doesn't need to know that kind of knowledge. It is irrelevant in a certain sense as far as the relevance of his everyday life is concerned. For example, I know how to use a computer, but I know very, very little about how a computer is made or how the software operates, or I don't know anything about it, yet I know how to use the typing system, or know how to open it or send an email, and I don't want to get involved in the other knowledge because they do not directly impinge upon the running of my everyday life. So sociology of knowledge, which Berger and Luckmann are trying to put forward, is the knowledge of your everyday life which is relevant to the kind of reality within which you are located. Now he goes on to say, we began by saying there is this objective reality which is out there, which has a certain pattern and order even before I enter it, but how do we have a role in constructing that objective reality or reproducing that objective reality? Now here, Berger and Luckmann tries to make certain distinctions between different levels of interactions and different kinds of situation. Now one kind of such situation is everyday life and face-to-face situation. The reality of everyday life is shared with others. In the face-to-face situation, the other is presented to me in a vivid present shared by both of us. I know that in the same vivid present, I am presented to him. My and his here and now continuously impinge on each other as long as the face-to-face situation continues. That is, for example, you're talking to your neighbor, or you're talking to your friend or your class friend, and you're directly facing each other. So your present is your presence, your being there, and your friends being there is right there continuously impinging upon each other. There is continuous interchange. There is continuous maybe expression in your face. Your friend is able to tell you that whether you are in a good mood or bad mood. Somebody smiles at you, the other person smiles, somebody frowns. We are looking at each other, we're gauging each other's behavior, we're making sense of each other, and we manage to understand what the other person is saying even when they are not speaking it. Now, what is interesting in exploring the sociology of knowledge or everyday knowledge is, how do we know? How do we know what my friend is thinking? Or how do I guess whether you are interested in this lecture or not? And the argument being made for is there is a shared reality. There is a stock of knowledge where there is a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions are taken for granted. Today he looks sad, dukhi hai. The person is not happy today. Now, the person hasn't said they're not happy today, but you are making sense of the situation by your familiarity with both the biography of your friend and the social context within which your friend is located. Berger and Luckmann then therefore says sometimes we may misinterpret. We may actually think that somebody is sad when the other person may be just distracted. But for the larger part in our life, we do manage to guess right. Now, guessing right what the other person is thinking is not rocket science. It's not because I can read somebody's mind. We are able to understand because we have symptoms of subjectivity. What do we mean by symptoms of subjectivity? Signs of subjectivity. When we are very happy, maybe we are smiling, maybe we are singing and humming a song, that is a sign of a subjective sense of well-being. You're not feeling good, you're depressed, you're lying low, you're not talking too much, you look distracted, you look low. Those are signs and symptoms of subjectivity of being low. So this is the shared knowledge, an intersubjective reality, that this reality is not only an objective reality, but is an intersubjective shared reality. The other aspect of this face-to-face proximity is that in some situations we are really very close, we are face-to-face, sitting side by side. But all other forms of relating to the other in some senses are remote. Right now, for example, the lecture that I am delivering is remote. I don't even know who I am addressing myself to. But does it mean I am completely ignorant? No, I'm not completely ignorant. I have some sense, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not. Maybe people interested in sociology, in the social sciences, maybe people interested in preparing for certain kinds of entrance or competitive exams, maybe students in the discipline, or maybe people interested in the theme per se. But we have a sort of rough assessment, a rough sense of what it is. But it is remote. That is, it is not face to face, where I can make out from direct gaugings of stimulus or symptoms what the other person is facing. Now, so the remote I cannot see, not just physically, but the fact that you are there, hypothetically, somewhere listening, if not now, maybe later in a recorded talk, that means I am in a certain sense subjectively close to you. I'm emphatically close, but there is a degree of remoteness between me as a teacher and you as long distance recipients of the lecture, as compared to a class I gave just an hour ago, which was face to face directly, where I could actually see in the student's face either excitement or boredom. So I could gauge how they were listening to me. And importantly, in the human action, as I speak, not only can you hear me, I can hear myself. This is truly what we understand by an intersubjective reality. An intersubjective reality which is mutually shared, where we understand each other, where we are emphatically close, but it is also an objective reality existing externally out there, already there before me. So when I come into this room where this lecture is being recorded, that room existed before I entered. That room will exist even after I go. that is a patterned objective reality. But even that a patterned objective reality has been constructed by humans, and I am one element of human action who has a role in reproducing that reality. I am one of those small elements in this large circle who have a certain understanding, okay, this is how I ought to speak when it's a recorded thing. This is a new sociology of knowledge, remote, not face to face. It's a new sociology of knowledge which is not my everyday life, the paramount reality. It is a different kind of reality from which I will retreat back to my paramount reality. But as a sociology of knowledge, I can keep getting examples from the everyday paramount reality to make my point understood. Now, I come sort of very quickly that when we say common sense knowledge is shared, like I was giving the example of when I speak and I look at my students and the students make sense of me, or students are talking to each other maybe about an exam or a jobs or employment, there is a certain sense common sense knowledge. It's common, it's shared. But is it the same to all groups? Remember, when we say common, we assume it is really common and equally shared. No. Common is only common to particular groups and sections. It's not common in the sense of being universal. It is not the same for everywhere. And I think, unfortunately, even in a globalized world of today, there's a great sense of difference. Knowledge is socially distributed. That is the other aspect of sociology of knowledge which Berger and Luckmann are talking about. It's different among different sections. It's differently distributed. My here is there. So when I say, oh, this is my world. But when you look at my world, you will say, that is her world. When I look at your world, I'll say, oh, that's your world. So whereas you will say, this is my world. My now does not fully overlap with theirs. At the same time, now I know that I live with them in a common world. Most importantly, I know there is an ongoing correspondence between my meanings and their meanings in this world, that we share a common sense about this reality. Let's take an example from contemporary India. Now, if you happen to belong to a particular region and you still live in your ancestral village and you live in a particular neighborhood where only members of your ethnicity or religion or caste or community live, then in a certain sense, perhaps the common sense is commonly shared. But supposing you decide you get a job and you migrate to the city and you live in apartment buildings in the new metropolitan centers of Delhi, and your neighbor may be coming from a completely different religion, community, linguistic group, etc. Now, and yet at the same time, you are now living in proximity. Your reality, which would normally not encounter the reality of your neighbor, are now proximus, they're shared, they're next to each other. Now you realize that their world, their food, their ways of thinking may not be yours. So mine here is there is separate from mine, and yet there is an ongoing correspondence. As I get to know each other, as we get to interact with each other, we start learning. We start learning about each other. Like 50 years back, many people in the South may not have been so aware of North Indian cuisine, and many people in the North may not have been so familiar with South Indian cuisine, or many people wouldn't be aware of Northeastern cuisine. But right now, say in much of contemporary urban India, most people would be aware about food which would be earlier belonging to a reality which was not yours, it was theirs. But now it has become part of your reality. So common sense also has mechanisms and strategies by which we learn to bring in a certain sense, their lives or their ways into our own world. There's a way by which we appropriate customs, food, worldviews from the other. It is there all the time, including language. when I was teaching sociology of knowledge some time back in my, real classroom, not virtual classroom, I asked many people that do they use the word knowledge? Knowledge is hypothetically supposed to be an English word, but the word knowledge is used across the country in many Indian languages. And when they use the word knowledge, what do they mean? So you notice that we are also a very flexible human beings. We are able to appropriate other realities and translate it into our everyday paramount reality which exists. I come to a very, very central concept which is very, very important to understand sociology of knowledge, and here I've already flagged it off earlier, the idea of the natural attitude. What we think, remember when we say socially constructed reality, socially constructed is very separate from naturally given. So for example, in our everyday life, we will think if we live in a patrilineal society where there's patrilocal marriage patterns, that is, line of descent is father to son, the surname will travel from father to son, the line of property will go from father to son. When you get married, the girl will move away from her natal family to go and live with her husband's family. It's patrilocal. It may seem natural, and people will live in those societies seeing it as natural. This is the natural attitude of the common sense consciousness. But the moment we shift our consciousness to a sociological consciousness of relative reality, we will put a bracket to that natural. That this natural, is it really natural? And is this common sense knowledge really very common? Or is it something which is very, very specific? The strength of common sense knowledge that it looks so normal, so self-evident, and so firmly embedded in the routines of everyday life that it becomes, in a certain sense, extremely difficult to challenge it in any fundamental fashion. Now, we come to something which is, very related to the idea of natural, the idea of taken for granted reality. The reality of everyday life is taken for granted as reality. It does not require additional verification over and beyond its simple presence. It's simply there as self-evident and compelling facticity. What do you mean self-evident, compelling facticity? The fact that you don't question its existence. It is just there. It is obvious. It's self-evident. Like if a young girls are discussing and they all say, maybe a girl a little older than them is getting married, and they'll all sitting together and saying it's so sad that she's so going, and they're going to miss her, but they're also very excited by the fact that she's getting married. That reality may appear extremely self-evident. Nobody's going to ask, but why? So its strength is its compelling facticity. Now, in such a situation, if you reverse the situation and say maybe instead of Kanyadan, you're having a situation where you are, the dan of the son. Now, is that possible, you will ask? It goes against the grain of society. It goes against the structural imperatives of society. That would look strange, unfamiliar, disorienting, as contrast to the taken for granted, self-evident life. Now we come to another aspect of this taken for granted life, the problematic and the unproblematic. Usually, as long as the routine of everyday life continues without interruption, they're apprehended unproblematic. If our life is going very smoothly, everything is wonderful, then we don't see any problem in it. But even the unproblematic sector of everyday reality is only until further notice, until its continuity is interrupted by the appearance of a problem. Let me give you an example. As somebody who's worked on gender, I tend to give a lot of examples from gender. but perhaps even from the educational sector. Say if a family which has a very happy life, a normal everyday life, and the young girl gets married and they give a big dowry and the boy is very nice and they get married and they live very happily, then this reality is unproblematic. No problem has occurred. But supposing there is a situation where the woman, and they will say that this is normal, this is how world should be. And they may even say that when the marriage doesn't work out, it may be the fault of the girl or the family or the upbringing, etc. But when there is a problem, the story turns sour, maybe there's an unfortunate development where maybe there is a case of harassment which happens after a few years of marriage, then the unproblematic sector becomes problematic because a problem has appeared and the taken for granted suddenly appears not so certain. When this happens, the reality of everyday life seeks to integrate the problematic sector into what is already unproblematic. I can't develop this argument, but if any of you are into research, you will find it fascinating that common sense knowledge contains a variety of instructions as how you can incorporate the problematic into the unproblematic into the problematic into your unproblematic. That maybe once marriage is broken and the girl comes back, and the same people who are first initially shocked, horrified, didn't know what to do, filled with tragedy, and then maybe the young girl studies again, does very well, becomes professional. Then they say that the world has changed and now girls have their own life and should have been silly to continue in a bad marriage. So common sense knowledge contains a variety of instructions of how you can integrate the problematic sector into what is already unproblematic. Now, we come to a key issue of the two dimensions of Berger and Luckmann, society as objective reality and society as subjective reality. These are two broad chapters, a lot of repetitions, because what they're really trying to say, one, objective reality existing out there external to you, the other subjective reality, which is your own meaningful, but which has a role to play in the construction of the objective reality, and the manner in which you create it is again drawn from the objective reality, the dialectics between subjective and the objective. The first point that Berger and Luckmann say is there's something very peculiar about the human organism. It is open, there is something plastic, flexible. And the human being becomes a human being. Of course, belonging to the 60s, they were not sensitive to the idea of gender, so they would use the word man and not necessarily man and women or human. The process of becoming man takes place in an interrelationship with an environment. Why is this so significant? Now, you would have watched, little baby calves being born and how after the first few minutes they stand up, or how they or a little lamb being born and how they stand up and become very quickly. They know how to walk, they know how to maybe even learn hunting with the mother, etc. So it's a very quick process. Whereas when the human baby is born, as you're aware of, the human baby almost needs a full year, from they're completely dependent. So the role of society, the family, the mother, the father, the family, the larger community has a very important role in making the child becoming a member of society. The process of becoming man, woman takes place in an interrelationship with an environment. And then there is a very novel fundamental question which is being posed, that humanness therefore is a socio-cultural variable. Very often we will say that man has a nature, and in some senses, yes, there are certain fundamental principles which are common to women and men from all societies, But it's also important to say that human being constructs their own nature, or put more simply, that human beings produce themselves. And there are many mechanisms by which human beings produce themselves, or human beings make the objective reality a fact. Now, they introduced the term institutionalization and argue that all human activity is subject to habitualization, introducing concept of habitualization, then concept of institutionalization. Habitualization implies that any action can be performed again and again, and the more you perform it, you become more efficient in it. You can do it with least effort. So habituation becomes very important in running a life. All of you who have learned how to ride a car or bicycle or scooter or bike, you would know that initially it is very difficult. You're fully conscious. What should I do now? How should I start the car? Or how should I park the car? What should I put off, etc. Likewise with the computer. But once you get into the habit of it, you can do it much more efficiently. Very true of cooking. If you first learn how to cook, everything is very, very difficult. Whereas as you learn how to cook and it becomes a habit, you can do multiple cooking at the same time because you have become so efficient in the manner in which you work. Now, the second aspect of institutions, apart from habitualization, that institutions also suggest historicity and control. All institutions are not the same. The family system in 2018 is very different from the family system maybe in 1618, So they have a historicity, and importantly, institutions also are important for control. An institution just doesn't mean the material building. It also means the knowledge system, and that knowledge system is important not just for functioning of society, but also for controlling. Reciprocal typifications of actions are built up in the course of shared history. They cannot be created instantaneously. Institutions always have a history of which they are the product. As somebody who is a teacher, I can tell you where did I learn how a teacher is supposed to behave. I would have learnt it by watching other teachers. So you would have a typification of what a teacher is supposed to be. And that kind of shared history can't be instant. It always has a history, and we are both products and producers of it. I've already discussed habitualization. I won't go into it detail. You have the PPT suggesting the nature of the routinization, as well as there are general stocks of knowledge which are embedded as routines. Now, this is what you must do when you get up. This is how you must prepare for an exam. So not only is there material institutions, but along the routines are embedded knowledge formation, which is important for you to function in your everyday life. Another concept, remember we talked about institutionalization. Before that we talked about habitualization and the relationship between institutionalization and habitualization. I introduce another concept now, typifications. Institutionalization occurs whenever there is a reciprocal typification of habitualized action by types of actors. The example I gave you, a teacher, she is typically a teacher. And the typification of habitualized action that constitute institutions are shared ones. All of us know what we mean by a typical teacher or a typical lawyer or a typical doctor. And this institutionalized world of the typical doctor, the typical lawyer, the typical mechanic, the typical police person is experienced as an objective reality. It is massive. It appears as huge. It appears that, my God, this is something which was out there always. But when we look at the processes of habitualization, typification, institutionalization, you realize, most importantly, that the institutional world is objectivated human activity. The institutional world is objectivated human activity. Another aspect of this knowledge, everyday knowledge, apart from institutionalization, habitualization, typification, is legitimization. The institutional world requires legitimized. They have to be explained. Why is this so? I gave you the example of patrilineality and patrilocality and patriarchy, and they will say, okay, this is how it has to be done. Women have to be protected, they are dependent, and that would be seen as not only explanation but also normative, as natural, taken for granted, certainty, given, do not ask, and central to learning our own lives. Now, in this entire process of legitimation, a process of typification, habituation, language is extraordinarily important. This language it absolutely helps us to communicate the stock of knowledge across generation, across societies, and gives the characteristic feature of the taken for granted reality. Every society has proverbs, kahawats, stories which will reaffirm the existing institutionalized. This socialized individual will accept the social world as a consistent whole. He will be constrained to explain both his functioning and malfunctioning in terms of this knowledge. The other aspect, finally, before we sort of close down, is society as subjective reality. We have discussed society as objective reality, society as a subjective reality. And we also explained that how the human being has a very certain plasticity and a world openness. And the argument that Berger and Luckmann says, there's a predisposition towards sociality, towards interacting, towards becoming member of society, and the objective world then becomes part of the internalization. It becomes internalized in human beings through language and what is often called socialization. That the socialization we participate, and this objective reality becomes part and parcel of our lives. There are two kinds of socialization, all of you would be familiar: primary socialization and secondary. The primary socialization is the early socialization with the family, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother, sister, brother, and this socialization has a very long-lasting impression because you're also emotionally attached. It's not just normative and cognitive, it is emotive. And the primary socialization makes it the central world. This is where your identity is formed, and identity, as you learn to be part of this world, not only do you learn to be who you are, you take on and understand what others are, what the generalized other is, how do others react to you, and all this is possible through language. So the primary secondary socialization is critical for the construction of social reality. And along with the whole question of primary and secondary, we have maintenance and transformation of subjective reality, which again is done through language, which is a repository of past knowledge. So in conclusion, we can say that there is role of knowledge in the dialectic of individual and society, personal identity and social structure, and it provides a crucial complementary perspective for all areas of sociology and social sciences. Thank you.